On March 17, 1982, as the thaw in the Ozark hills of Missouri began to expose the harshness of the past winter, a social services assistant named Margaret Wilson drove into the remote Shannon County to visit a secluded cabin. Her discovery there would permanently reshape her view of profound social isolation and the devastating cost of institutional failure within America's rural heartlands. The Shelton property sat 27 kilometers from the nearest town, Current River, reachable only by a dirt track that turned to mud each spring. The family had existed, with virtually no outside contact, for more than 30 years. Margaret's visit was prompted by an anonymous tip to the Missouri Department of Social Services, alleging that children on the property were living in unsanitary conditions and might be victims of abuse. When she arrived, Margaret was met by Elijah Shelton, 47, a man of average height with a graying beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold the burden of generations of solitude. Elijah shared the cabin with his sister Martha Shelton, 43, and 3 children, Thomas, 12, Sadie, 9, and young Jacob, just 5 years old. The cabin itself, erected by Elijah's grandfather in the 1920s, was a wooden 2-bedroom structure with a kitchen and a living area. The land held a small barn, a vegetable patch, and a well. There was no electricity or running water. Their seclusion was almost absolute. With only rare trips into town for supplies, they couldn't produce themselves. The weather that day was cool, around 17 degrees, under a partly cloudy sky. The recent snowmelt had left the ground around the cabin soft and muddy, and the air carried the distinct scent of damp earth and rotting wood. On her initial walk through, Margaret observed that the children displayed signs of mild malnutrition and a clear lack of essential medical attention. Thomas had a badly healed scar on his right arm, the remnant of an axe accident the year before. Sadie had a slight strabismus that had never been addressed. Jacob, the youngest, showed indications of developmental delays for his age. But what truly captured Margaret's attention were the powerful physical resemblances shared by all 5 individuals. They each had the same striking blue eyes, the same bone structure in their faces, the same shape to their ears, traits that hinted not merely at relation, but at a dangerously close bloodline. When questioned about the children's mother, Elijah paused briefly before stating that his wife had passed away during Jacob's birth. Martha stayed quiet, keeping her eyes away from the social worker. It was at this moment Margaret started to feel the story didn't add up. County records held no marriage certificate for Elijah Shelton. In fact, the only documents located were the birth certificates for Elijah and Martha, children of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a land deed from 1924. The children had no official birth certificates. The Shelton family's isolation had deepened following the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a fire back in 1973. Since that tragedy, the siblings had severed nearly all ties with the community, only venturing into town for absolute necessities. Residents of Current River described Elijah as a quiet, wary man who avoided any lengthy conversation. The first inklings that Martha might be the children's biological mother started to form in Margaret's mind as she watched the family's interactions. The way Jacob clutched at Martha's skirts, how she intuitively understood each child's needs, and how her gaze revealed a profound maternal connection that seemed to go far beyond a typical aunt's affection. If you want to follow more cases like this one, stories that shake the very foundations of society and bring hidden truths to light, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single investigation. Further digging confirmed they were first cousins. It's not unheard of in isolated communities like this one, a local historian consulted by the team explained. The early 20th century, many families in these mountainous areas lived in such seclusion that marriages between close relatives happened out of sheer lack of options. In some cases, it became almost a tradition, justified by beliefs about bloodline purity. This discovery cast the case in a new light. This wasn't necessarily just a single instance of an incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha, but potentially a pattern of generational inbreeding that had intensified over time. The team developed a new theory. Elijah and Martha's parents, already first cousins, had passed down their isolationist beliefs. After the parents' deaths, the siblings, already socially cut off and likely influenced by twisted ideas of family and purity, entered into an incestuous relationship that produced 3 children. The investigation briefly stumbled when a local resident claimed to have seen another woman on the Shelton property in the early 1970s. This information momentarily supported the idea of a third person, perhaps a wife of Elijah's, who later vanished. However, subsequent inquiries revealed the witness had likely confused the property or the date. Sheriff John Pearson, weighing the allegations, started considering a court order to secure DNA samples from the children and adults. Yet the legal process was complex, particularly given the family's isolation and the absence of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect, warranting such an invasive step. "We have to tread carefully here," the sheriff argued. "These people have lived this way for generations. To them, this is a normal life. If we storm the property without hard evidence, we could lose any chance of ever helping those children." The investigation settled into a stalemate that would last for months. During this period, the Department of Social Services continued its regular visits, monitoring the children's welfare and slowly attempting to build a rapport with the family. The true turning point in the Shelton case arrived in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation began. During one of her routine checks, Margaret Wilson noticed that Jacob, the youngest, was running a high fever and showed symptoms of a serious respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial refusal, she managed to persuade him to allow the boy to be taken to the hospital in West Plains, the nearest large town. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist who had been consulted on the case, seized the opportunity to conduct more detailed tests with Elijah's reluctant consent as he had accompanied his son. The results from Jacob's examinations revealed multiple, subtle congenital anomalies that individually might have been overlooked, but together painted a clear picture of a high degree of consanguinity. "The genetic markers we are seeing here," Dr. Brennan informed the team, "are typical of children born from relationships between first-degree relatives. The level of homozygosity is excessive even for first-cousin partnerships." During Jacob's 2-week hospitalization for pneumonia complications, Martha stayed constantly by his side, displaying a striking maternal care and anxiety. It was during this period, physically drained and emotionally spent, that Martha finally began to open up to Margaret. One evening, as Jacob slept under medication, Martha shared pieces of her story. She spoke of the growing isolation after their parents died, of how Elijah gradually took on the role of family patriarch, and how the boundaries between family roles slowly blurred. "We didn't know anyone else," Martha confessed in a near whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to tear us apart, to harm us. He said we could only rely on each other." While Martha never explicitly admitted to being the children's biological mother in that conversation, her words and emotions made the reality increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, taking great care not to shatter the fragile trust being built, avoided direct paternity questions, focusing instead on providing emotional support. Meanwhile, the documentary investigation pressed on. A major advance occurred when researchers located a traveling pastor, Reverend Samuel Miller, who had ministered to isolated Ozark communities during the 1960s and 70s. Reverend Miller kept detailed journals of his visits, including observations on the families he encountered. An entry from June 1969 described a visit to the Shelton property. He visited the Shelton place today. The parents recently perished in a tragic fire, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah, 34, and Martha, 34, and Martha, 30. Found them in profound poverty and isolation. Offered spiritual and material aid, but was met with suspicion, especially from the young man Elijah. Something about the dynamic between the siblings troubled me. Martha appeared submissive, almost fearful. I worry that without the moderating presence of their parents, isolationist as they were, the situation may deteriorate. I intend to return, but confess I felt powerless. A later entry from April 1971 was even more revealing. Returned to the Shelton property after nearly 2 years. Was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed more hostile and paranoid than ever. From a distance, I caught a brief glimpse of Martha. She appeared to be in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting they might need medical care, he became enraged, accused me of spreading falsehoods, and threatened me with physical violence if I did not leave immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but was told that without concrete evidence of abuse, their hands were tied. These mountains guard their secrets, and I fear some are too dark for the light of day. Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating the investigation's suspicions. Another pivotal event occurred when authorities located medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed she had been admitted in advanced labor and had given birth to a baby boy with multiple health complications, including respiratory distress and a minor heart defect. The birth date matched Jacob's approximate age. The medical team at the time had noted concerns over possible genetic abnormalities and recommended further tests, but Mary Smith discharged herself and the baby against medical advice as soon as they were stable. While Jacob recovered in the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with limited judicial authorization, performed additional tests that showed the boy had a rare genetic condition called Apert syndrome, characterized by malformations of the skull, face, hands, and feet. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence rises dramatically in cases of close consanguinity. Armed with this new evidence, Judge Eleanor Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA testing for all 3 Shelton children and both adults. The results, returned in November 1982, were conclusive. Elijah was the biological father and Martha the biological mother of all 3 children. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth. If you believe all cases of familial abuse deserve to be investigated, no matter how isolated the community, let us know. On December 7, 1982, based on the genetic evidence and testimony gathered, Elijah Shelton was formally charged with incest, a Class D felony in Missouri punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Martha, viewed as a victim due to evidence of long-term psychological coercion, faced no criminal charges, though her fitness as a guardian was challenged in family court. Elijah Shelton's trial began in February 1983, drawing significant regional media attention, despite efforts to keep the case discreet to protect the children's privacy. The Shannon County Courthouse became the stage for one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in its history. During the proceedings, Elijah's defense, led by public defender Gerald Thompson, argued that his extreme isolation and the dysfunctional environment of his upbringing had robbed him of the ability to understand basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton had deliberately cut off their children from the world, denying them formal education and normal social interaction. The defendant, Thompson contended, is a product of generational isolation and likely previous inbreeding. He is the son of first cousins who raised him to believe the outside world was hostile and that the family must remain unto itself. The prosecution, represented by Amanda Lewis, acknowledged the mitigating circumstances, but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant demonstrated the capacity to interact with the community when necessary, to conduct basic business, and to deliberately conceal the true nature of his relationship with his sister. These are not the actions of a man unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha Shelton testified behind closed doors. Edited excerpts of her testimony, released later, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that began after her parents' death when she was 29 and Elijah was 33. According to Martha, Elijah assumed total control over every part of her life, isolating her further and convincing her that the outside world posed a threat to their safety and family unit. "He told me we were special," Martha stated, "that our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they wouldn't be tainted by the outside world." I resisted at first, but after years alone with him, I started to believe it. Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in the effects of social isolation and abusive family dynamics, served as an expert witness, explaining to the jury the profound impact of extreme seclusion and prolonged indoctrination. What we observe here is a textbook case of an alternate reality constructed through isolation. When an individual is systematically deprived of all normative social reference points, their perception of acceptable behavior can become radically warped. The trial also exposed the failure of local institutions to identify and intervene in the situation. Evidence showed that concerns had been raised by at least 3 different people over the years: Reverend Miller, the neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and a clerk at the current River Supply store who had noticed the similarities between the children and adults. In no case was adequate follow-up action taken by the authorities, revealing systemic flaws in monitoring isolated communities and protecting vulnerable individuals in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury found Elijah Shelton guilty of incest but recommended leniency due to the mitigating circumstances. Judge Eleanor Simmons sentenced him to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months and mandated compulsory psychological treatment. In her final remarks, Judge Simmons stated, "This case represents a collective failure, not just of the defendant, who is nonetheless responsible for his actions, but of a society that permits entire families to fall beyond the reach of our protection and support systems." Geographic isolation must not be allowed to become institutional abandonment. As for the children, the court placed them in temporary state custody, while Martha received intensive psychological therapy. The long-term goal was family reunification, provided Martha demonstrated the ability to care for the children properly and integrate them into the wider community. The children were placed with a foster family in a neighboring county, where they began receiving formal schooling and medical care for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, showed remarkable resilience and adaptability, quickly catching up to his peers academically. Sadie faced more challenges with social adjustment, but responded well to treatment for her strabismus and other health issues. Jacob, the most severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct his malformations and began intensive therapies for his developmental delays. Comprehensive genetic screening confirmed all 3 children carried multiple anomalies resulting from inbreeding. Thomas had minor issues like his polydactyly, which was surgically corrected, and a predisposition to certain autoimmune diseases. Sadie had more significant problems, including a rare enzymatic deficiency affecting her metabolism that required ongoing medication. Jacob, as previously identified, suffered from Apert syndrome, among other complications, necessitating lifelong medical care. The Shelton case prompted significant policy changes in Missouri and neighboring states. The Shelton Act, passed by the state legislature in 1985, established stricter protocols for monitoring families in remote areas, including regular social worker visits and wellness checks for all children, irrespective of formal complaints. Elijah Shelton served 22 months of his sentence before being released on parole in 1985. A condition of his release barred him from returning to the family property while the children were in Martha's care, and he was required to undergo continuous therapy and supervision. Martha, after 2 years of intensive treatment, regained custody of the children in 1984. With state assistance, she moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains, where the children could continue their education and medical treatments. She earned her JED, the high school equivalency diploma, and eventually found work as an assistant at a local library. The Shelton family story continued to evolve over the following decades. Thomas, the oldest, overcame the adversities of his upbringing and graduated with a degree in social work, dedicating his career to helping vulnerable children. Sadie faced more struggles, battling chronic health and psychological challenges related to her past, but ultimately found stability as an artist and craftsperson. Jacob, despite his physical and cognitive limitations, achieved a semi-independent life with community support and became an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in rural areas. The Shelton case remains an iconic subject of study in social work and law programs across the nation. illustrating the complex interplay between geographic isolation, rural poverty, dysfunctional family dynamics, and institutional failure. It also underscores the profound physical and psychological consequences of inbreeding, not only for the directly affected children, but for generations that follow. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, a retired Margaret Wilson reflected on the case in an interview with a local paper. What stays with me, looking back, is how something so extreme could happen practically in plain sight. This wasn't a cabin in the absolute middle of nowhere. It was less than 30 kilometers from a town, in a county with resources and institutions supposedly designed to protect the vulnerable. It makes you wonder how many other similar stories are out there, hidden in remote hollows or right under our noses, waiting for someone to pay attention. The original Shelton property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by the state in 1990. The cabin crumbled over time, but the land remains a silent testament to how extreme isolation can distort reality and perpetuate cycles of harm across generations. If you've made it this far, it's because you care about these cases that leave a permanent mark on families. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so we can see who truly cares about the pursuit of truth. Don't forget to like this video and share it with others who value understanding the complexities of human nature and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that button now to follow more investigations into cases that force us to reflect on our society and our collective responsibility.